Fieldworkers, Women, Botany in 19th Century Canada. My name is David Galbraith. I'm the head of science here at Royal Botanical Gardens, and it's been a pleasure to be a part of this process, this project from the beginning. What we're going to do today is say a few preparatory words, a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll go into our program. So first of all, please make sure your cell phones are turned off or turned to silent as we get going. If for some reason a fire alarm goes off, we must vacate the building completely. So please, I'm only saying this because once in a while it goes off. Please head out the door and to your right again past the cafe and the bathrooms to the parking lot where we have an emergency assembly area. My colleagues asked me to do the thing about, where the emergency exits are and doing your seatbelt, so consider that done. If you're not familiar with the building, it's a little bit complicated, but it's actually not too bad. So just out to your right as you go out the door, and bear to the right past our cafe are washrooms, in case you're looking for washrooms. And that's always a handy thing to know where they're going to be. Right, so I'm going to do a couple of things first as we get going. First, and let's make sure our clicker is working. Come on, click. Oh, there we go. Clicker's working. Okay. So, went too far. Come on. Yeah. So, on behalf of the volunteer board of directors, Nancy Rowland, our CEO, our volunteers and our staff and all of our members here at Royal Botanical Gardens, it's a great privilege to be able to welcome you to this book launch and to RBG Center. If you haven't been here before, I hope you might have a chance to look around a little bit before you take off again. Out front, you might have noticed that Ian Elliott from A Different Drummer Books has lots of copies of today's book. If you've pre-ordered it, he'll have it for you there. If you haven't, you can buy another one or buy as many as you like. He'll have them. He'll be happy to sell them. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the long history of First Nations and Métis people in the province of Ontario and pay special respects this afternoon to the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are the holder of a treaty with the Crown for the lands that RBG stewards today. This area is within the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Neutral Nations. The Neutrals no longer being extant as an organization or as a group. And one of the things we try to do when we do a land acknowledgement here is not just make a rote statement. The land acknowledgements are about trying to connect today with the land and the people, and especially the Indigenous community. And this is a really interesting case in point and illustrative of what we're going through at Royal Botanical Gardens, because I'm sure you will read this many times in the coming months. It's a beautiful work, but you'll notice that it does not extensively cover Indigenous knowledge. We did not try to approach Indigenous knowledge in this project. This is really an account of women in the settler community and some men, and what they were trying to do to understand plants from their perspective, from their scientific perspective. There is increasingly out there fantastic Indigenous voices that are reclaiming their space and taking up the cause of talking about their knowledge in ways they feel appropriate. So just as a caveat from the beginning, one of the contexts of this project is that although these people in the 19th century, many of them were interacting with Indigenous peoples, and it certainly comes up in the book in various places. This is not a book about Indigenous knowledge, and it's just taking it on as what it is. This program has been amazing to watch from the beginning and be part of. I'm not sure when it was that we were first approached by the editor of our program, Professor Anne Steer from the Center for Feminist Studies at York University. It must have been at least 6 months before the meeting. Yeah, it was, a year or two before a workshop at York, we started getting ideas about getting together to talk about this topic, about what was known about the role of women in botany in 19th century Canada and what new resources were out there. Because what's been happening in the past few years is that more archives are coming online. Sources that people 20 years ago wouldn't have access to, you can find on Google now. So there was a big set of discussions around 2016 about this. And almost exactly 5 years ago, it was 5 years ago this coming week, the authors who are here and several others convened at the Archives of Ontario, which is at York University, for a 3-day-long workshop to talk specifically about the role of women in botany in 19th century Canada and what we could learn about the individuals, the institutions, what they were learning, what they were publishing, their challenges, their contexts, and perhaps center people whose voices had not come through before. So I will leave any further description of that workshop 5 years ago to Anne, but we've gone through an amazing process since that time of all of our contributors bringing their manuscripts together, working with each other, and especially with our editor, and then with McGill Queen's University Press to put together the book that you now have access to. And we are all immensely proud of this process and of everyone's assistance. It's also really great that we're holding this at Royal Botanical Gardens. When we get to the panel, I will highlight the contribution of a couple of our colleagues who are here from RBG, our curator of our herbarium, Nadia Cavalin, and our librarian and archive specialist, Aaron Altz. Both were very involved in this behind the scenes and helped many of the authors out. So there's historical reasons why we're doing this here as well. So what I'm going to try to do, if all of the machinery is working, and there's our itinerary, thank you, is call upon Jonathan Crago from McGill Queen's University Press to say a few words of greeting on behalf of the publisher. If we can, are you going to advance the slide or should I try to get this one? There we go. Nope, too far. Sorry, I'll stop. You do one. There we go.
Hi, everyone. My name's Jonathan Crago. I'm speaking to you from the McGill Queen's offices in Montreal. And I won't say too many things here, but just because I know we have a great roster of contributors and speakers, both from the book and from the Royal Botanical Gardens, our gracious host today. But just to underline that books like this one are the work of many hands and many minds, especially a book, especially Flora's Fieldworkers, which is about a topic with so many women and so many plants as its subject. It makes it a diverse enterprise and a collaborative volume as well, with so many contributors bringing their research and knowledge to the book. And it was a privilege to work with Anne and the contributors on this book. And just on behalf of my colleagues here at the press, there were several of us that worked on the book, the seen or unseen. I just wanted to express my thanks. It's been a privilege to work and collaborate with you all on this book. And just to underline that, because these books are something that is the work of many hands, it's really nice to underline the book's entry into the world, as it were, with a collective gathering like this one that can really start the discussion that we hope will continue for many years as the book makes its way into the world and onto the bookshelves and into the hands of many, many readers. So thank you all, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the event.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was our next episode of Doctor Who, going through a time loop. Sorry, we had a bit of a technical glitch at this end, but that does happen from time to time. So you know why we're here. You know what we're up to. We did have the itinerary up there a moment ago. We're going to have some talks from the authors who are available today to speak to us. Then we're going to get the folks who are involved up here for a panel chat. take your questions, discuss things amongst ourselves, hopefully get into anything you might be interested in early on. After about an hour of that, we'll take a break, and the authors as available will be parked over along the side here, and we'll be very happy to autograph any books you want autographed. We'll have that. Not just this book. We'll autograph anything you brought with you. And you can pick up books. There'll be coffee and tea available, provided very generously by McGill Queen's University Press for us. So without any ado, I hope the format makes sense to everybody. And for our speakers, as we get going, the ideal situation is you will have this little machine in front of you, which has a laser beam on it, but also front and back arrows. Most of you are probably very familiar with this. It's a radio device that talks to one of the computers over there. You do not have to point it at anyone. It should simply work if you gently press the button. If you want to highlight something, unfortunately, the best thing to do is just to turn around like this and use the laser. So if that's okay, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Anne Steer, our editor. Anne is Professor Emerita at York University, where for many years she has been looking into extremely interesting problems on the history of women in science, with a special emphasis on botany. Anne, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. Sound okay? I want to thank you so much for coming to the book launch for Flora's Fieldworkers. So you've all seen the book, the heft and the beauty of this book. Please join me as I start now in having a look at the image that's up on the screen. Right? The slide shows the first page of a magazine that was put together by students in a girls' school located in Hamilton, Canada West. Magazine is dated, the issue of this magazine is dated February 9th, 1848. The school was called the Burlington Ladies Academy, and completely serendipitously, it must have been located somewhere here in the vicinity of our current location. Wonderful serendipity, the rewards of research when you never know what will come at you. The slide shows the lead article. And it's a lead article that promotes the study of botany for girls. Now, you'll see it, it's not super clear. Where's my pointer? Bear with me. There we are. Oops, back. Hold on. Okay, I need someone's help. Come, David. Just get me, oh, there we are, back there. I just wanted to get the pointer going. And that is here. There we are. So it's the study of botany, the study of botany. And so it promotes the study of botany. Why, my question is, was it botany for girls? The reasons are characteristic of mid-19th century writing in English Canada and across colonial and imperial British domains. And I want to draw your attention to just a few key passages. They're in the fourth paragraph. It's hard to see, but it's just this paragraph from which a long paragraph, I'll just be excerpting a tiny bit for you. It reads, "The study of botany is adapted to refine the taste and improve the heart as well as please the eye. Perhaps no science more effectually combines pleasure with improvement. To the female, this science particularly recommends itself. Surely no lady can investigate the perfect order of nature in the formation and growth of flowers without receiving lessons in regularity and system, traits so essential to the female character," end quote, quote unquote. This magazine was brought to my attention decades ago by a very beloved feminist research colleague of mine, and it made my researcher's nose very itchy and twitchy. Why did this matter to me as a document? The reasons begin with, this is a focus on women, which has been the focus of my research and kind of my generation of feminist research now for a long time. It deals with women's education. It addresses in many particular ways, and no longer full piece, styles of education and purposes of education for girls. It focuses on plants as an object of study. This magazine's account is a plumb line into a British tradition that made its way to 19th century Canada and that became in itself a way into nature study for some communities. It reflects an approach to nature as a path to self-improvement. And it also promotes and avidly promotes nature study, and especially plant study, as a good part of path to self-improvement. The gender dimensions of this article are very powerful. They are dimensions that we're familiar with of that time. They're part of beliefs and practices that clearly have a long history. They predate 19th century Canada. They predate things British altogether. And these gender dimensions have a very long reach and so many echoes, as we know, in social, cultural, and political domains across the world. These are global phenomena with many local contextualized differences. Today, here we are, 170 years after publication of this magazine from the Burlington Ladies Academy. And we're here to launch a book about women in botany in 19th century Canada. Our book, I'm thrilled that so many of our contributors are here with us. Our book is written from a variety of our own contemporary perspectives. And we're doing this in October, which you may know is Women's History Month in Canada. It is also, as David and someone else has pointed out, October when we had our initial workshop. So, you know, the stars are coming together. There we are. Now, Flora's Fieldworkers has its own history, as David has already mentioned. It goes back to the workshop that we held at York in 2017. And the purpose was to bring together researchers who wanted to know more about women, plants, and botany in 19th century Canada. We were an interdisciplinary crew with contributors coming from women's history, literary studies, botanical history, the history of science, the history of education, art history, garden history, and book history as well. Everyone shared an interest in the topic of women and plant study as widely understood: botanical, the horticultural, the floral, artistic, visual dimensions as well. Who we asked during our workshop were the women who were active in botanical work and plant study of various kinds. How did they come to know about plants? What were their roots into that kind of study, that kind of engagement? And what were their contributions? What did their plant work mean to them? Is it something explicit? Do we need to dig? What tools do we use to dig and try to suss out what their botanical work may have meant to them? And how do we find them? Where do we find the material about them? Where do we find the material by them and about them? The results of this inquiry, from workshops into drafts to final publication, is a book that focuses on women and plants in 19th century English Canada, largely settler Canada, as David has mentioned, and with one chapter on women in Australia. Some of the women were British arrivals, fresh British arrivals. Some were settler women, and some were born in Canada. Looking at them as a group, we found women who collected plants and reported about their findings, who drew, painted, and illustrated plants and incorporated them in craft work, who corresponded with others about plants, both from the experts to their fellow practitioners and enthusiasts. They wrote about plants, they taught about botany in multiple forms, and they were activists, active on behalf of knowledge of plants in a wide variety of domains, as you'll hear. Now, the material in our book developed at a time of many challenges within British colonial and imperial practices, many challenges to that world within that world. Now, in our own time, we too face challenges in many domains: environmental concerns for all parts of the biome, fragility in institutions and social cohesion, an urgent need to strengthen scientific literacy. We need to expand access to knowledge for people who have had fewer opportunities before because of social class, privileges of color and ethnicities, and because of gendered beliefs and practices. We know it's a time for openness to other kinds of knowledge and other perspectives on nature. Still, in the midst of all of this, there is interest and urgent interest in finding women, and that interest still matters. Regarding women and plants in Canada, this means researching Flora's fieldworkers in diverse communities and traditions, Indigenous, Francophone, among ethnicities across the wide diverse qualities of this land. And we need to work to make their histories audible and visible. So Flora's Fieldworkers is a book about discovery, and it's also a book about rediscovery. I've often found on my own research into women and botany historically in Britain and in Canada, that the women that I thought I was discovering for their botanical interests and activities, collectors, writers, artists, teachers, for example, they were often known about in their own day and in earlier times. It's we who haven't known about them because all too often they have not figured in historical records. As we know, historical records are far from neutral. They're shaped by assumptions about whose contributions matter, which activities count, which activities are acknowledged and taken seriously in our hierarchy of values of knowledge. There's clearly much needed work to be done to enlarge the story of the past and so to enlarge stories for the future. Flora's Fieldworkers is organized in roughly chronological order, moving across the 19th century. To give you the flavor of the book, it's now my pleasure of presenting 10 of our authors to you in person, by pre-recorded video, and live by Zoom. This, as David has explained, will be followed by a panel discussion and Q&A. Okay, now Flora's Fieldworkers opens with a section on Lady Dalhousie, her name without her title, Christian Brown Ramsay, Scottish plant collector and keen botanist who found herself in British North America when her husband was here as an imperial administrator in the 1820s and 30s, and who later went out with him to India. One of her herbaria resides here in RBG, and I hope we'll be hearing about this from Nadia later. So first, I would like to welcome garden historian Deborah Reed by pre-recorded video from Edinburgh, Scotland, to present her chapter. Her chapter is entitled A Botanical Journey of Discovery, Lady Dalhousie in British North America. Okay, so over to her, please, our technicians. Sound?
about my contributions. I take this opportunity to say a big thank you to our editor, Rusty Steer, who has guided us all throughout the process with unfailing patience and determination. So thank you so much, Rusty. When I started my doctoral research in 2010, I thought I might be lucky to find maybe 3 or 4 examples of Scottish garden women who were active in the 19th century and did more than simply create their own gardens. But as it turned out, I found 13 women who went beyond their grandparents and achieved within a wider public sphere. And each of them made a contribution to our understanding of botany and horticulture. One of these was Christian Ramsey, who was the Countess of Dalhousie. And I'm delighted to have provided the opening chapter to Flora's Fieldworkers. And this chapter charts
Deb Reed with us for this, and we all enjoyed her work so much and her presence. Our next presenter, also in this mode, will be a presentation by botanist and historical botanical historian Jacques Cowet, distinguished a botanist, a federal botanist in Ottawa, who is a major researcher on grasses and on the botanical history of Canada, especially Francophone Canada. His chapter is the chapter by a botanist about the botanical possibilities of knowing, having information about historical plants. And his title is Lady Dalhousie's Orchids and Other Rare Plants in Lower Canada, 1820 to 1828, Resources for Historical Study. I hope that we can hear him.
Thank you very much. And I was very, very pleased to be asked to be part of that project because it's a different discipline than mine as a botanist. It could be a challenge to work at the same time into different disciplines, but it's very, very rewarding. As a botanist, for instance, if I want to look at the plant collection by Lady Dalhousie in Lower Canada between 1820 and 1828, just using botany, I will have access to herbarium material, to published material, but I will have missed very, very important sources like archives, as the one that were in in Halifax, and all albums also that not necessarily part of the herbarium, the album of the Darlington Herbarium in the States, and the album also at the Canadian Museum of Nature. And there are also other old resources in old books in botany. Together, I was able to put together a good number of plant collection and plant reports of Lady Dalhousie. It's because just of the mixture of these disciplines. I did that with other time in my career, mixing botany and geology and geomorphology to explain, some botanical problems. So if you mix disciplines, it's very good. The results of that will be very, very helpful for the Quebec provincial government protection agencies, as well as the private protection agencies, because one important fact in the rare plant protection is the focusing on the first collection of a plant. And because we know the date, we know sometimes, most of the time, the area where it was collected. So we are able to understand why it's no longer there. But sometimes the plant is still there. So it's very, very important information. Working with various disciplines may have some disadvantages. And I met one of this disadvantage in writing that chapter. As a scientist, botanist scientist, there is a way to write scientific papers, to write scientific chapters, to write floras, but to write something in the same perspective, in the same format in this book was a very challenge for me. And I really appreciated the help of Anne Steyer and my assistant to help me to rewrite my words in something that would fit the purpose of that paper. I really very appreciated to be part of that. And I just hope this information will be a plus for the Canadian botanical history and botanical history by women in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. Jacques Howet's piece is an important instance of the value of a collection like this that is interdisciplinary in its intention, that brings together different styles of writing about plants, the historical, the botanical, the visual, and the difficulties as well about reaching across styles of writing and vocabularies that explain the purposes of botanical work. For him, it was so important to do groundbreaking close-up botanical work on a series of documents from that early period to show the application of the historical knowledge that he was able to cobble together, its application for current practices now in environmental work and environmental policy as well. Just to mention, there's one further chapter in this first section of the book written by Virginia Vandenberg, who isn't here, that brings post-colonial perspectives to bear on a letter that Lady Dalhousie wrote during her travels to India, another rich and interesting dimension of the work. Now, the next section of the book is about women plant collectors directly as a unit. And I rejoice that Sarah Maroski, a historian of Australian botany, is joining us live from Melbourne, Australia, 16 hours ahead of us, to speak from her pioneering work. I hope it works, fingers crossed, from her pioneering work on women plant collectors in that part of the world. Okay, fingers crossed. Let's see if it works. The title of her chapter is, as you see, Baron Ferdinand von Müller's Plant Collectors at Home with the Australian Flora.
Good morning, everyone.
Oh, there she is.
Excellent. I'm talking to you this morning, and it is morning here. It's 20 to 6 from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. And before I begin, I'd like to pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders and to acknowledge that the Wurundjeri have never ceded sovereignty of their land. Now, my presentation in the workshop in 2017 and my chapter in Flora's Fieldworkers is about Australia. As Rusty says in the introduction to the book, my contribution invited reflections on the similarities and differences between women's experiences in different places in the British Empire. Now, despite the fact that Australia and Canada are about 16,000 kilometres apart as the crow flies, I have been struck by the many similarities in the botanical female experience in the two countries. And this includes the kinds of elite and settler women who dominate the narratives and the strategies that they use to gain access to botanical knowledge. And these include the trope of modesty, of being useful to distant male colleagues, and a recognised role in the education of children. I'm left wondering, however, to what extent these similar patterns emerged due to intercolonial contacts between the two countries. We certainly have the example of women travelling from the imperial centre to the colonies, such as Lady Dalhousie, who's received so much deserved attention in the book. And in Australia, the counterpart to Lady Dalhousie would be Lady Franklin, who was wife of the Governor of Tasmania. And both of these women brought botanical information and connections to settler women. But was there any direct contact between women in the two colonies? The closest thing that I found in my chapter was the relationship or friendship between Australian botanical artist Alice Rowan and American writer Alice Lounsbury. The two women met in Washington, DC and travelled together for a couple of years in search of native plants. And the result of this relationship is two books on botany, written by Lounsbury and illustrated by Rowan. The collaboration makes me wonder if there are more such connections to be found, and that really our work in the workshop is an introduction to a field of research, not just its conclusions. And I suspect that these connections, if they do exist, are likely to be highly informal, but nevertheless very powerful in shaping the lives of individuals. I'm going to conclude by giving you an update on an exciting project that I'm involved in at Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria in Melbourne. Last year, an anonymous donor came forward to fund the production of an annotated bibliography on women's contributions to the gardens. And I took on the work of producing the bibliography, using in part my experience with Flora's Fieldworkers to help identify categories for women's contributions. My mantra for this work has been that in history, women are always there. And that's a fact not only because we are 50% of the population, but because we have relationships with men. And my success in bringing together 80 pages of materials is in part due to that I have become more sensitized to the often intangible nature of women's contributions to cultural heritage. And I'm thinking here of the quilts in Vanessa Nichols' chapter in Flora's Fieldworkers that speak to intergenerational connections between mothers and daughters. Mary Brenton specimens in Rusty's chapter that make sense in the context of a relationship between an expert male botanist and an amateur female collector. And Dawn Baisley and Catherine McPherson's reframing of women botanical participants as citizen scientists. My bibliography is now being used as the basis for a program of amplification of women's achievements at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria. And the first fruit of that project is the appointment of a Wikimedian to create biographical entries on female botanical workers for Wikipedia. Best wishes to you all. I wish I could be there, and let us continue to compare and contrast our research. Thank you.
This part of the book, the section is on women collectors, also includes my own chapter about Mary Brenton, a woman who contributed plants from Newfoundland in the 1830s for a major British flora of North America, edited by William Jackson Hooker, a very notable part of a story of British botany at that time. This section also features as well a chapter by Dr. James Pringle, Royal Botanical Gardens' own Jim Pringle, a plant taxonomist and a historian as well, who by his research enters a woman named Alice Hollingworth into botanical history for her early and foundational explorations in the Muskoka district of Ottawa. Jim is very sorry he can't join us today, so I'm just telling you a bit about it. Oh, Jim, please stand. Are you able to? Jim, sitting in the third row in the corner. Hello, Jim, welcome. Catherine Partrail is likely the one botanical woman from 19th century Canada that may be familiar to some of you because of her book, Canadian Wildflowers. And I'm delighted that Michael Peterman, an editor of Trail's Writings and Letters, will now speak to his chapter about her. I welcome Michael to come up here. His chapter title is Catherine Partrail, a natural historian in changing times. Thank you, Michael. You need a clicker?
Hello. Glasses are a necessity. I came to this project and this impressive book as a literary scholar. In the late 1970s, I had been drawn to the absence of documents and life details concerning Canada's early pioneer writers who happened to settle in the Peterborough area where I was then teaching.
In particular, Catherine Parr Trail and Susanna Moody. They were two of 6 sisters, the Strickland sisters from Raden Hall in Suffolk, and of the 6, only 2 immigrated to Canada. Of the 6, 5 became professional writers. So you can see that Trail and Moody both had their kind of roots in writing before they came to Canada. Over the years, I worked closely with 2 other scholars, one from McMaster and one from York. The McMaster scholar was a man named Carl Ballstad, who had begun work on Moody and Trail long before I did. And together we edited a number of their books, we collected their letters, and we brought forward a complex and interesting set of human beings and writers who hadn't really been apparent before. The letters were extremely important in this whole process. So we did 2 books of letters on Susanna Moody and 1 large one on Catherine Parr Trail, which contains, I think, about 300 of Trail's letters. We had to dump about 200 of them because U of T Press said enough. That's one of the problems you work with. It's not like they want to do everything. Of the 2, Trail was a special kind of challenge. Her published writings were diverse and many-sided. She was drawn to nature and to a natural history in a way that Moody wasn't. One aspect of her writing was floral study and flower information. And this led to 2 books very late in her life. Canadian Wildflowers, which came out in 1868, and it was arguably Canada's first coffee table book, if they had coffee tables in those days. And the second one was Plant Life in Canada, a much more detailed and interesting and ambitious book, which came out in 1884. So these 2 were a particular challenge to me. Both had interesting stories behind them, but it called for a scientific input that I really didn't have particularly. Nevertheless, I published an essay on Catherine Parr Trail as a botanist in 1990, and I thought that was it. I did what I could, and I settled with that. However, there was soon a reply. I'm not sure how many years it took, but Marianne Gosley did an essay that kind of refuted some of the things I was asserting in that book. In particular, that Mrs. Trail was an amateur botanist. The word amateur is so lethal in these discussions that you have to be very careful. I didn't realize that at the time. Still, it gets used a lot because amateur carries with it a sense of love for what you're doing and so on. And I thought that was essential to Trail's view. All of that led eventually, another 20 years goes by, and I end up as a part of the workshop that Rusty organized at York University in 1917. And the whole experience of that workshop and of Rusty's very capable editing has been both educational and inspiring to me. I now better understand what Catherine Parr Trail stands for in evoking in the evolving history of Canadian botany and as practiced by women. And I came better to measure her achievements as a pioneer writer who, when she came to Canada in 1832, began to study flowers and ferns near her log cabin doorstep. She branched out further, but she couldn't go very far because, unlike Lady Dalhousie, she had very little means. It's hard to define. I mean, it's easy to sort of talk about Trail as a member of the colonial elite, but in many ways, I don't think she was. I mean, she came with her British antecedents and so on, but she had very little money, very little opportunity to travel and do different things. So what she did because she loved to do it. It was for her a lifetime commitment, a passion, and a daily practice. She lived, I don't know if there'd be anybody in the room here who lived as long as Catherine Partrail. She lived to be 97 years old. And she spent the last 65 of her years in Canada, where she developed this interest in botany. So let me just offer you as a parting piece. I went, this is, I think I pointed this out. This is letter, the Book of Trails letters called I Bless You in My Heart, selected correspondence of Catherine Partrail. And I was looking for a letter that I could just read a little bit to you from. And where is it? This is a letter dated July 10th, 1899, written from Stony Lake, a place on Stony Lake. She'd been very sick. She was suffering from rheumatism and from gout and any number of things. I'm not even sure she knew what she was suffering from, but she was having a better day in this instance, and she always wrote. I think she died with a pen in her hand, frankly. But she writes, but I began to rally on Saturday, a better night, and yesterday afternoon was fine. And with the help of Kate's arm, that would be her daughter, Kate, and the good stick, I got a few yards up the slope and had a nice time with cushions on the rocks among the lovely grasses and shrubs beneath the pines. Lots of flowers and berries made me quite happy. She died maybe 4 months later. So that's a little take on Catherine Partrail.
Catherine Partrail may be the person who is known to most of us at the start of this project. And she is a person who will really benefit from much layered study, as Michael is pointing to, because she sits in the middle of so many different cross currents of 19th century science and 19th century society and 19th century gendered norms, ideas about science as amateur, as against the professional, the specialization, the more generalist, the natural history, the taxonomic, right there. And she's stuck in the middle of different styles of writing science as well. To think of science writing as having become its own sort of genre. This is the way you do it. You don't do it that way or else it doesn't fit. She sits there. So a rich person to inspire further work. But now I'd like to introduce Karen Stanworth to come and join us in this same section. Karen, a historian of education in Canada, an art historian by background, writes about museums. Her work includes pedagogy and the rise of university education in natural history and botany. And the title of her chapter for our book is Botany, a Prominent Study, Isabella McIntosh's Ferns and Natural History in 1860 Montreal. A quadruple whammy of topics here.
Thank you for the introduction, Rusty. Never did meet her as Anne. I'm going to talk about how I came to be here, because after the workshop, I had to say to Rusty many times and other people, it was probably the best conference I went to in my 30 years as a scholar, because it was truly interdisciplinary. And I've always been on the edge of anything academic. Don't quite fit here, don't quite fit there. You know, she asked me, are you a historian of education or art history? And I said, well, kind of everything. And the history of education part is something I resisted for a long time. But actually it was Rusty really who pushed me towards that. My background is in visual culture. I'm interested in how we learn visually. My heavy book is on visual culture, called Visibly Canadian. And in that, I was looking at how the visual realm in 19th century Canada was extremely important, because that's how so much information was communicated. And if we think about the sheets that the botanists were preparing, that was a form of visual communication. It was very powerful with writing and imagery and approved languages that shifted over time, and a form of illustration, very specific, that is also deeply steeped in a set of changing traditions about how we consume information about plants and biology. And we tend, in looking back from our perspective, to think of botany as complete in some way. I'm going to try to keep it fragmented. And botany is, as a word, is what fascinated me. I was curious about why does botany emerge? Where does it come from? And when I saw it show up in the work of that I was researching for Isabella McIntosh, it pulled me towards an investigation of botany, which I had not really been planning on. I met Rusty, we were talking about shepherd. That's why we initially met, an earlier chapter in my book. And it had caused me to look at a very early museum in Canada, Literary and Historical Museum. And it included work by Shepherd, who was writing and participating in the Learned Society in 1829. What this means is that there is some documentation of that period from women, and then they just drop right out. And they literally get dropped from the Literary and Historical Society. They weren't allowed to be members by the time Isabella Glass McIntosh came along. They were no longer admitted. In fact, they were never really admitted to the Literary Historical Society either, but both Shepherds actually got in under the auspices of a short-lived learned society called the Société Encouragement des Arts et Sciences in Quebec City. And so I traced that. And as I was tracing it, I was getting involved in the lives of these women. So when I met Rusty, I said to her, well, you know, there's someone else in the book who does botany. And of course, she jumps on that. She says, well, you want to give a paper on it, a workshop I'm planning? And I thought, oh my goodness, what have I done? So I don't know anything. I'm not a scientist. But encouraged to be there as an interdisciplinary scholar, I went through what I had on her because I was interested in her as a teacher using object lessons. Well, some of the objects that she was using were botanical sheets, botanical illustrations. And so, you know, it led me down a garden path to some archives. So I'm just going to take 2 minutes to talk about my incidental finds in the archive. The first one, I'm looking at this composite photograph, and I'm being a good visual cultural historian, and Nora Haig at the McCord Archives comes out and says, well, do you know about the Butte School album? I was like, no. So that started a whole set of questions. I'm going through that, and it's fantastic. I mean, it's like an art historian's dream. All these images together, telling a story about the girls going to this school and the teachers and the professors from McGill who were coming and giving lectures. So that opened up my research. And then I dove in a little deeper when Nora again said, oh, but did you see the scrapbook? And scrapbooking became really super popular in the 1850s. And continued as photographic albums were also being developed. So you have this combination in scrapbooks by about the 1870s, where you're getting a lot of photographs and other kinds of imagery in them. So I went very carefully through this scrapbook, which was Isabella Glass McIntosh's own scrapbook, her collection of bits and pieces, ephemera of her life, obituaries, notices in the newspaper, and in the back was an envelope stuck in there. Inside the envelope were a pile of letters and reports. And this gave me the clue to the teaching, because the reports were the annual reports written for Butte School by Isabella McIntosh. And in those reports, I got the history of the emergence of the teaching of botany. Without them, I wouldn't have known. But there's a couple of years missing. So I don't know where they are. I don't know what happened, but I do know that she must have collected these, or one of her students collected them, because the student was the one who made the Butte School album for her as a gift when she retired. So there's this little synchronicity that happens basically coming out of Nora's head, who's now retired, because the McCord Museum was the one where the materials from the Natural History Society ended up being collected. So you have this sequence of things that just happen. And so I'm not going to claim to be a historian of science or education or art, because all of them are together, and these academic divisions are ours. They're not hers. So the one quote that I want to end with is a quote from the Dominion entomologist and botanist who became that in 1887. And in 1894, he wrote, her work, Mackintosh's work, is one of the greatest botanical achievements that anyone could achieve. She was not considered an amateur.
Continuing with the theme of art historians, many of us associate women with drawing and painting flowers, but this history, as our next presenter, art historian Christina Huneau will show, is layered. This history is complex, and this history needs careful and very gendered readings. I invite Christina to the stage, and her chapter is entitled Botanical Albums as Theoretical Objects, Sophie Pemberton and the Logic of Identity.
Good afternoon. Let me add my voice to those of others in thanking the RBG for organizing this event, and especially to Rusty Shear for her vision and skill in bringing this fascinating volume together. Rusty told us that this is Women's History Month in Canada. For those of you in the room who are not familiar with Anne Stier, I want to let you know that you're in the presence of a giant here in the history of women and science and history in Canada, and really a role model to so many female academics. My point of access into botanical history has been through its artwork, and especially through the many watercolor drawings of wildflowers made by settler women across Canada for about a century, from the early 1830s through to the opening decades of the 20th century. And such drawings were often assembled into albums, like the one that I'm trying to show you here. This was made by the artist Sophie Pemberton in the 1890s, at the beginning of her short but distinguished career. More often than not, albums such as these have been discussed as feminine arts of accomplishment. They've been a bit burdened by their associations with Victorian parlors and genteel breeding. And so they have often been passed over in silence by writers on botanical art. And it is true that these albums by Canadian women typically lack both the scientific detail and the technical sophistication that are associated with those European copperplate engravers who worked under the very careful scrutiny, indeed the iron hand, of professional botanists in the 18th century. Yet to discount Canadian women's albums as insufficiently botanical for serious notice is really to do them a disservice. And this, I find, is true in two quite different ways. In the first instance, it would be to blind us to their importance within the history of botanical publishing. For women's wildflower albums were the direct precursors of the first botanical field guides that were produced for the general public. Books like these were authored and illustrated by women in the 1890s, and the images that made these big sellers with the public were a clear continuation of the tradition of albums, watercolor albums, that their mothers and grandmothers had been creating for the better part of a century. But the other thing that we lose sight of, if we think of women's botanical albums as mere feminine pastimes, is the very distinctive logic that they contain. Let me explain. Art historians have long been aware that certain artworks have the capacity to embody and even shape our thinking about complex issues. The clearest example that I can give you is the pictorial device of linear perspective. Developed by artists during the Italian Renaissance, linear perspective cast the viewer as the irreducible center around which all the objects in a painting or a drawing or a print disposed themselves. And by doing that, linear perspective encapsulated the developing logic of humanism that placed mankind at the center of our own world. For me, the experience of looking at a botanical object, a botanical album, contains an equally powerful, though quite different, logic. And that is a logic of identity. Now, to get a sense of what I might mean there, we need to turn to the art. To flip through the pages of a botanical album, this is Sophie Pemberton up on the screen, is an engrossing experience. Each petal, each leaf is utterly unique. And yet, at the same time, once you've seen one botanical drawing, there's a sense that, at least a little bit, you've kind of seen them all. For their format is almost always the same. Come on. The lighting is always neutral. The perspective is always frontal. The plants are isolated in the center of the page, and the hues are of uniform intensity. In fact, it's this background of similarity that makes the differences of each plant really shine through. It is, I think, at the heart of their aesthetic appeal. This play of sameness and difference, it isn't just pretty to look at. It also embodies a pattern of thought that we use, all of us in this room, when we think about identity. When philosophers, I'm just elevated you all to the status of philosophers, when philosophers talk about identity, in fact, it is exactly this logic that they use. A thing can be said to have an identity when it is demonstrably the same as itself and different from something else. In other words, the pictorial engine of botanical illustration is also its theoretical engine, engaging us through practices of botanical identification to think about what identity itself might mean, the ways in which we are who we are because of who we're not. In my chapter, I put this insight to work in order to ask the question, what might this pattern of thinking about similarity and difference and identity, what might it have meant for the Canadian women who practiced botanical drawing. For as a final page from Sophie Pemberton's album reminds us, the practices of botanical identification have also been profoundly gendered. Men are God's trees, it proclaims, and women are God's flowers. Did the logic of botanical drawing reinforce such hackneyed Victorian ideas about gendered identity? Or did the logic of botanical drawing work against this kind of thinking? That's the question that I most wanted to understand when I set out to write my chapter. But since my 5 minutes are up, I guess you're going to have to read the book if you're curious to know the answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. It's a very provocative chapter. I encourage people to see it. Now we move from art and craft to decorative work and to Canadian quilts. And it is my pleasure to welcome Vanessa Nicholas, a historian of Canadian visual and material culture, to report from her research on floral imagery and quilt making. Her chapter is entitled Slips and Seeds, Botany and Horticulture in Two 19th Century Canadian Quilts. That's it.
Thank you. Just give me 1 second. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you sincerely to Rusty for including me in this volume. I wasn't actually a participant in the workshop that brought everyone who contributed to this work together. And I'm so humbled and grateful to have been invited into the conversation. So thank you. Thank you also to everyone here at the RBG. I actually had a very productive research day here a few years ago that helped me shape some of the ideas in my chapter. And it's really nice to be celebrating here in particular today, the launch of this book. Let's see. Oh. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I just had one slide. Okay, I will be without slides. So my contribution to this volume speculates that Victorian Canadian women engaged with questions of place and cultivated cultural identities using the floral decorative language that was typical of their home crafts, including embroidered quilts. So my chapter looks specifically at 2 embroidered quilts that were made in 19th century rural Ontario. One featuring floral designs that are evidently very much influenced by the botanical illustrations and floral paintings like the ones you saw in the previous slides in Christina's presentation. And the other seems to depict a dooryard garden typical of rural Ontario at the time. For today's presentation, I'm going to focus on one small detail in the botanical quilt, which is known as the fallow field quilt. And if you have a copy of the book in front of you, the quilts are illustrated in there, so you can refer to those if you'd like to follow along visually. The quilt is a patchwork of embroidered linen squares that was, or has been recently attributed rather, to a woman named Elizabeth Bell. Bell was an Irish settler, and she most likely made this quilt in the late 1840s, just before she was married, in the village of Fallowfield, which is now a suburb of Ottawa. The quilt has a large central medallion that is embroidered with a bouquet of flowers, and the medallion is surrounded by small linen squares, 81 of which feature individual floral sprays, all embroidered in wool. There are 5 squares that feature a particular design that intrigued me because it is very reminiscent of the red trillium flower that is indigenous to the temperate woodlands of Eastern North America. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the trillium as it's our provincial flower here in Ontario. The trillium was unfamiliar to Europeans, and it has no precedent in Old World embroidery. Unlike many of the other flowers on her quilt, which are identifiable British florals that are very typical of British embroidery. Since few regional botanical inventories would have existed in the 1840s at the time that she made her quilt, I speculate that Bell likely captured the details of this flower in nature using direct observation, producing a sketch of the flower, and then translating this sketch into her embroidery design at home by tracing it onto fabric. We can indeed imagine her admiring red trillium flowers as a young woman on a nature walk in a local forest bursting with new growth during one of the spring seasons preceding her marriage. Bell's trillium design situates her within the history of British women who undertook the task of identifying and collecting unfamiliar plants in British North America, many of whom are discussed in this volume. For example, Lady Dalhousie, who we heard about earlier, and Catherine Cartrail. Our editor, Anne Stier, has shown that 18th century British literature encouraged women to study plants and flowers within the bounds of the household. The Fallowfield quilt is a visual and material representation of this popular and gendered form of botanical science that emerged in 18th century British culture. But more specifically, Bell's trillium flower design is the product of the British female botanical tradition that, as Christina Huneau has shown, flourished in 19th century Canada. In her chapter, which you just heard a presentation on, Huneau establishes that the botanical art produced by Victorian Canadian women tends to reveal an interest in individual plants rather than ideal types or specimens, an approach that may have been informed by the perception that a Canadian identity is forged in direct contact with nature. As an expression, or rather, because of this importance of the physical experience with nature and its relationship to female Canadian identity, Canadian women also developed generalized botanical pastimes like gardening, which I explore in my other case study, and floral decoration in embroidery and decoupage and other home craft forms. And this generalized botanical culture had very little to do with science. As an expression of both the tradition of natural observation and this broad culture of floral imagery that informed Canadian female identity, the Fallowfield quilt arguably was informed by Bell's effort to cultivate a sense of belonging in a new land far from her childhood home. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanessa. The final section of Flora's Fieldworkers is entitled Expanding Public Practices. You're going to hear first from David Galbraith, head of science here at RBG, who has been studying 19th century botanical gardens in Canada and compiling visual materials from this history. And after that, we'll move immediately on to Dawn Baisley, a plant ecologist and STEM activist, who, with historian Kate McPherson, who's not here today, a chapter entitled Women's Citizen Science and Botanical Knowledge in Ontario, 1870 to 1920. Come on up first, David.
Thank you, Rusty. And again, my apologies, Vanessa. I don't know what happened to that slide. It's entirely my fault. I was the slide wrangling person. The experience of working with everyone who contributed to this book and the workshop that preceded it, and especially spending time with Dr. Stier, has been transformative in the way that I look at a bunch of things, most importantly, storytelling. I think ultimately, it's all about actually the stories we're telling, whether they are being told through a visual medium or in the formula that we use in science. Ultimately, if something catches a human being's imagination and a human being's heart, it's because they've been told a good story. And what I came away with from compiling all kinds of facts and figures and historical bits and pieces was the context, adding context to the facts and the figures and making a compelling human story out of what could be fairly dry. So I had a lot of fun with this. Talk about transdisciplinary. So I'm a wildlife biologist by training, but I spent a lot of time in conservation biology, and most recently I've become a historian, cultural heritage expert, and manager of archaeology projects. So how's that? And thanks, Don. And I became very interested in the things we are in, like what is a botanical garden? I was hired to join Royal Botanical Gardens staff many years ago, having never been here. I was not a botany person or a botanical garden person. And ever since, I have been trying to figure out what this is. You know, is it a museum? Is it a garden? Is it a place where volunteers do things? Is it an archive? Is it a living museum? And all of these things are part of the story. I've been enchanted to find out, for example, the genesis of botanical gardens. And we've heard from a couple of people about herbarium specimens, the collections of plants that end up pressed and dried. Go through one person named Luca Ghini, an Italian Renaissance botanist who created the idea of a herbarium and created the idea of a botanical garden. There's stories here which go back 500 years. And yet, when you look around at a place like this, you don't see the history very much. You see the garden as it's presented today. And I'm currently writing another book chapter on the founding of RBG itself. And what I've been finding is that you cannot just look at something and assume you understand its history. You've got to go deeper, because this place is amazing. Every place is. So what I tried to do in making some sense of the story of 19th century botanical gardens in Canada was to look at where they came from, who was involved in creating them and why, and particularly why they all spectacularly failed. Again, you look around here, and this is this great big place that was launched in the 20s and became incorporated in 1941, and it seems like it's been here forever. But most of the botanical gardens that have been attempted in Canada prior to 1900 only lasted a few years, and then they fell apart. A great example of an early garden in Canada was at the Attendance Palace in Quebec City. In the middle of the 18th century, there was a very important botanist here named Michael, I'll get it wrong. I thought it was Michael Gauthier. His last name was Gauthier. He was a physician, and he collected an enormous amount of plants and contributed to knowledge, which all went to Paris. And then a few years later, when the British took North America from the French, he was forgotten. All that work was swept aside because he wasn't British, and they weren't interested very really. Although that's a great site today because there's been excavations there archaeologically, and they found the plants in the garden. We have the reconstructed list of the plants in that garden from the seeds in the soil. We found that the first botanical garden in Canada was founded by our friend Christian Brown Ramsay and her husband, George Ramsay, the 9th Earl of Dalhousie. And this was intended as a scientific enterprise. We often see botanical gardens today as a place for public recreation, and that's a really important role. We want to reach the public and connect with them. But botanical gardens started as a scientific institution with an underpinning of trying to understand the plants, understand their uses, how could they be propagated, how could they be put to constructive use. So Christian and George together came up with the idea of having a botanical garden in the Canadas. As far as we can tell, it was their idea. And he tried for years as the Governor General of Canada, like this is like the highest person in the land for the British government, to create a botanical garden, and the British government wasn't interested. And so when they left in 1828 to go back to England, the whole project fell apart. No botanical garden. The next project that came up in a serious kind of way, I'll just skip past some of George's correspondence. He was writing to his British friends, pleading for £100 a year to support the garden because he was paying it out of his own pocket, and they wouldn't have it. One that you sometimes find in the literature came up 40 years later in Kingston, Ontario, at what is now Queen's University. And this was the Kingston Botanic Garden, founded by the Botanical Society of Canada. And it had a really interesting aspect. The Botanical Society was a group of scientists and some people from the community who wanted to promote botany as a science. They wanted to promote learning and engagement with botany, and they thought a botanical garden would be a great appliance, the term that they used, a great appliance to promote botany in the public. And so they created a botanical garden to try to promote the mission of their society. And unfortunately, Queen's University was utterly uninterested. There were several people in the university that were very high up that were involved initially in 1860. But the proponent of this program, George Lawson, left in 1863 after getting honked off with the principal, moved to Dalhousie University, actually. And the botanical garden was abandoned. There is no botanical garden at Queen's University now. But we have a couple of photographs of it. There are some records, and the society published a journal for 2 years, which is an incredibly rich source of information about the people involved in the project, including women. Over 30 women are named in the journal as contributing to its work, the work of the society. And in doing this research, I found my heroine. I'm in love with Kate Crooks, I admit it. I'm a sad man. Catherine McGill Crooks is fascinating. This woman was born in what is now Niagara-on-the-Lake in 1833, the youngest of 5 daughters. Her father died when she was only a few years old. There's a connection to Hamilton because her family, anybody around here heard of Crooks Hollow? That's her uncle. Her uncle created the industrial complex in Dundas called Crooks Hollow. She was apparently self-taught. She became a very active botanist, and she's also on the first list of Canadian known entomologists, published around 1863. She contributed a whole bunch to this botanical society, including reading papers at their meetings. She collected plants. She collected a very large herbarium of Canadian plants that was part of a big exposition in London, England. We don't know where they are now. Some of them might be at McGill. Our fingers are crossed, but they're in storage. So Catherine Crooks is amazing. She's buried, in fact, on the Burlington Heights, just 4 miles from here. Huge, long story. The botanical garden at Queen's University fell apart. There's one piece of it left. It's this specimen. Collected by George Lawson in 1863 in the garden, it's a weed. He was probably trying to figure out what it was. And it may have come in as a seed on another plant, but this is all we have left of one of the first botanical gardens in Canada. It's a single herbarium specimen. Now today, the site is the Queen's University Arboretum. It was designated their Arboretum in 1999. So what I tried to do in my chapter is to just take a look at where these things came from, what the people were thinking behind the projects, and the women who were involved. We were able to recover some really fascinating stories about the Kingston Garden and the several women who were involved in that as both scientific contributors, including Catherine Partrail, and also as members of the community who were drawn to the idea of the botanical garden as a community exercise. That was already there. And of course, Christian Brown Ramsey and her contribution in creating Canada's first botanical garden. So thanks very much. I will get out of your way for the moment. I'll be back though.
Don Baisley, who will tell you about why and how knowledge, botanical knowledge matters now, so that women in our day, even in our day, are not written out of the botanical record.
Thanks, Rusty. Can you hear me? At the back, good. So I love this podium, and I like to own this podium when I'm up here, which is not often enough, but it's been several times in a few years. So hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for staying with us because it's a fabulous day outside and fall colors are at their best. Okay, let's see if this will work. Okay. So my journey to this book launch began in 2016 when Professor Rusty Steyer, who I've known for actually quite a few decades at York, I'm older than I look, and so is Rusty. The editor of Flora's Fieldworkers invited me to join what was her latest historical project. By the next year and the conference presenting my initial research, I had enlisted the help of an actual historian, Professor Kate McPherson, my co-author, who sends her regrets. She's been really busy this last week and she's pretty tired with conference attending and so on downtown. Together, Kate and I looked at how the disruptive technologies, so that's a term that is applied to Twitter and Facebook, you know, all these technologies that are allowing us to do things differently. But we wanted to look at disruptive technologies of 150 years ago and how they could have helped women living in Ontario to participate in doing botany outside of the home, to which they'd all been consigned. Because as I now know, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, elite aristocratic women were participating in public science conversations, Ada Lovelace, etc. But then they were sort of shoved back into the garden and the kitchen. So how could they do this? Move on here, right. So the first professional botanist in Canada was Professor Carrie Derrick, who was a professor at McGill, and that was 1912. She got put on the payroll. So how could women do botany before you could have a paid job with the title botanist and be present in public botany and horticulture? So from 2017 on, Kate and I immersed ourselves in Canadian horticultural magazines and books to discover that despite not having these professional titles, women were very active and were recognized at the time by their peers. Everybody knew about them and what they were doing, yet they kept on being forgotten by subsequent histories, and you know, they just kept on disappearing. And why was that? Well, more on that later, because I have an opinion on that. I have lots of opinions. So it turns out that women pretty much invented the field guide. They were doing a lot of botanical activities like running successful gardening businesses, including in Mississauga. And you can see some of the books and the field guides here. As has been mentioned, Catherine Partrail and Agnes Fitzgibbon's Wildflowers of Canada was like a coffee table book, but these were field guides. You could put them in your pocket and run around and identify what was out there. They were very popular. The book sold well, and Maud Gridley Peterson's book, How to Know Wild Fruit, was still in print decades later. So this was a really, really big thing. Furthermore, the first strictly Canadian-focused gardening book was by a woman, Mrs. Annie Jack, and it was a free gift if you took out a subscription to the Canadian Horticulturist magazine published by the Ontario Fruit Growers, and that was a nefarious organization. I can tell you more about that later in terms of what they were trying to do. So many of these women later fell out of the conversations about women's botanical activities, but there was a lot of rediscovering happening thanks to our feminist historian colleagues in the 1970s to 90s. But unfortunately, a lot of this has fallen out of more recent consciousness of women doing science, including botany and ecology today. So in our chapter, hopefully this will work, Kate and I wrote about Laurie Dunnington Grubb, but there is a poster about her outside. She co-founded with her much less eminent husband, Sheridan Nurseries. It's still going today, but it's her husband that gets the attention in a recent history about Mississauga. Likewise, I bet everyone here has a Peterson field guide of moths or shells or plants or birds. Turns out that Virginia Peterson invented the range map. She holds the copyright. If you open a page, you'll see copyright Virginia Peterson, but she is barely mentioned in the record of these books. She's like totally forgotten. So why does this erasing of women from current written records just keep happening? I like how sociologist Professor Michael Kimmel puts it in his popular TED Talk on gender equity, about how white men have benefited from the biggest affirmative action program in the history of the world. It's called the history of the world. So the driving tendency, it's unconscious bias in all of us, is to tend to give credit to a bunch of white blokes out there who were kind of somewhere on the table and in charge, and we kind of just keep forgetting about everybody else that was in the room. And this is what's happening. So in conclusion, then, Scholars, particularly scholars from the social sciences and humanities, and if you're in STEM, science, tech, engineering, and math, you also always have to team up with an actual living historian to do this kind of work, or an actual sociologist, or an actual political scientist, and I do this all the time. So we're now understanding these reasons for the erasure of women's contributions. We do know that today's disruptive technologies of social media are helping to connect women who are interested in these historical women and their activities. And Ada Lovelace Day Wikipedia Editathons. Thank you, Sarah, if she's still online, Sarah Morosco, who hosted me to give a talk at RBG Victoria when I was in Australia a few years ago. I'm glad to hear they're going to do Wikipedia pages for these women. So that these kinds of activities have helped with a rediscovering of these women and putting them back into the digital historical record. Thank you, Rusty. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And I can remember having coffee with you in the early 90s when you were writing Flora's Daughters and you came to have a chat with me about what I thought about this. Did I even have a historical thought in my mind about botany? And I did. I'm glad to say that I did. Thank you. Oh.
We've given you, I hope, something of a flavor of the chapters that make up Flora's Fieldworkers. I do want to mention that at the very end of our book, we have an afterword written by eminent historian of Canadian science, Suzanne Zeller, in which she reflects on the themes in the book. And we were very honored to have her contribution to that. Now, before we turn to the next section of our afternoon together, that will be the panel discussion and a Q&A. David will look after that. I just want to say a few thank yous. I want to thank RBG for its contributions of people, resources, funds, and enthusiasm for this project. Our launch event is also a celebration of them, especially David Galbraith, who was part of the project from the earliest stages. I'm very grateful also to Alison Prokop and the technicians for their work on this book launch. Please stand up. Let us salute you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And on behalf of all the authors, I believe it's okay for me to do this. Here is my general shout out to the libraries, the archives, the librarians, and the archivists who received our questions and joined in our sense of discovery about material that they themselves may sometimes never even known about. That we found in the course of work. I think it's run as a strand through many pieces in the book. And finally, thank you to McGill Queen's University Press for creating a beautiful book in design and also in the color illustrations. It's a lovely quality work. Special appreciation to Jonathan Crago, editor on the project, enthusiast and a great supporter over the time that it takes to bring a volume like this to the page, and now today to this book launch in this location. And we thank them also for sponsoring the refreshments that are here for us afterward. And so I'd like now to hand the microphone over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Rusty. I appreciate we've been at it here a while, guys. It's 3:45. I think, first of all of us who have already been up here barking at you, standing up on our hind legs, as Rumpel used to say, barking. I think we'd like a break. So why don't we take a few minutes, it's maybe even 15, because the bathroom, you might get a lineup and you have to wait and all of that. Maybe get up, walk around a little bit, chat with your friends, chat with your authors up here, whatever you'd like to do. But we'll begin the panel as close to 4 o'clock as we can to give you guys a break and to give us a break. And I don't want to suggest the panel is going to be a great long grindy thing. We'd originally thought we'd wrap up around 4:30. I think if we have a nice half-hour conversation with our authors and with your interest, that would be fantastic. So take it easy, guys, for a few minutes, please. Again, thank you so much to Allison, Corinne Davidson-Taylor, and Tristam Little, who've been handling things over there despite inevitable digital hiccups. Thank you so much, guys. Not yet. That would be nice. Yeah, Allison, do you know when we can actually get the tea fired up? Allison, Ali, hello. Hello, do you know when we're actually going to have tea available? Oh, okay. You do have to come back at 4:30 for tea, before 4:30 if you want tea. Anyway, okay, thank you. And of course, if you're staying around for the second segment of this afternoon's program, please visit the lobby and purchase several copies of the book. If you haven't gotten one already, go ahead and pick one up. And of course, you don't have to wait until the panel is done to purchase your book. Thank you.
It's particularly is published 1955.
Yeah.
I don't know if you did look it up or not.
I think so.
Yeah. So there's a good drawing somewhere of it. So, I mean, it went in here.
And there are photographs that aren't much after that,
Yeah.
which do show
But it
gardenish
existed.
things.
It
Yeah,
existed.
yeah. Well, there's so many threads go through that. Interestingly, some of the same people who were involved in the Central Normal or the Toronto Normal School were involved in Rusty's Burlington Training Academy for women, because they were all the Ontario Methodist people in alliance with Ryerson around education.
Mhm.
And they were setting up these colleges here and there.
Mhm.
The one that was in Hamilton called Burlington had been elsewhere for a few years, and it disappeared by about 1851.
Mhm.
Didn't last long.
Well,
But
because the normal school was 1855. Maybe you got some
I'm just
correct.
gonna announce. Hi, folks. We're getting back close to 4 o'clock. So if you'd like to come back, if you can hear me out there, I don't know. Does someone want to go outside and go, oh yay, come back inside, please? And I'd like to invite all of the authors and Aaron and Nadia. Nadia's not in here now. To come on up on the podium and join us up here, please. Do.
Finding directly into the object process. So that the students will now into the house to learn from the application. So they could then teach art. So there was a little clip somewhere.
Yeah, it was undoubtedly the best organized of any of the early 19th century attempts. The one in Kingston was all over the place. And there's a very good suggestion that was actually proposed by a guy named John Litchfield, who was a really big piece of work. He was not a doctor, but he claimed he was. And he eventually became in charge of the Kingston Psychiatric Hospital. And after they found out he wasn't actually a doctor, they made him train and become one. But it might not have been George Larson at all. He's usually credited as the botanist. Okay, looks like we're getting a couple of more people here. Karen, Rusty. Yeah, we've lost Michael.
Yes, my God.
I'm not sure who else. Are we expecting anybody else yet? We've got Vanessa. Okay, well, thanks again for hanging in with us. I hope again you've already bought several copies of the book. Christmas is coming. Stock it up for next year's Christmas as well. It ages very well. So it's my pleasure to begin a conversation of our panel discussion. And also, I noticed, Ali, so our audience microphone is no longer there. Oh, we now have an audience microphone holding person.
Is that working?
Here we go. So we now have a portable microphone with a person underneath
Is
it.
this working? Yeah. So there.
Yeah. So to turn these microphones on, you do have to switch them on if they're not actually doing something for you. So I think that one's working. There's a green light that comes on if it's working. What I'd like to do is, again, just refresh you on the wonderful people we have on the panel. I'm going to start at the other end. At the far end, we have Erin Alts. Erin is the librarian and archives specialist here at Royal Botanical Gardens. Thank you. She comes to RBG having spent several years at the Fisher Rare Book Library at University of Toronto, I believe, or which one was it? Okay, turn your mic.
St. Mike's.
I was at St. Mike's University.
Okay, but a specialist in ancient manuscripts and really old, delicate stuff that falls apart if you breathe on it the wrong way. But Erin has brought an amazing perspective to her work at Royal Botanical Gardens. Of course, it's not simply the function of a librarian to be here, but to understand the material we have in our collections, articulate it, put it into context. And Erin was terrifically helpful in the work of 5 years ago and many of the papers that you've heard about today. So thank you, Erin. We wanted to highlight this also because RBG has a facility here, which is relatively unknown. We're trying to change that, called the Center for Canadian Historical Horticultural Studies, or CCHHS. And this was started by the estate of Howard Dunnington Grubb, who died in 1964. He left some money behind, and one of the beneficiaries was Royal Botanical Gardens. And we established in 1979 this center, and it's under Erin's purview. Beside Erin, we have Nadia Cavalin, our herbarium curator, in her wonderful fern shirt. As was referenced several times, Royal Botanical Gardens is honored to have part of the Countess of Dalhousie's original 1820s plant specimens here in our collection. Our herbarium's about 62,000 specimens in total, plus some special collections. And the Lady Dalhousie or Countess of Dalhousie material is an absolute historical gem. It's of importance both historically and scientifically. And we're really excited to have that here. We have Dawn Baisley there next to Nadia, who you've heard speak about her STEM transdisciplinary work. Vanessa is next to her. And again, I apologize about missing her slide. Buy the book, there's beautiful pictures of quilts in it. And then Catherine, Karen, and Rusty, whom you've all heard from. So I don't think I need to really introduce you guys again. So I wanted to, again, thank everyone for coming out. And I thought I'd start with a question and lobbing one out. I'll get back to my colleagues just so that we have a chance to explore a little bit more about why this is here, why we have all this stuff going on at Royal Botanical Gardens, which is, Erin, can you tell us a little bit about what we're able to discover about the history of horticulture and the involvement of people whose stories might not have been told so far in the kinds of records and publications we have in our archives?
Yeah, so in the Center for Canadian Historical Horticultural Studies, we have the bulk of it is made up by 30,000 seed catalogs that are dating back from about 1820s to contemporary times. And those are wonderful, offer wonderful insight into kind of who was doing the business around horticulture. So you have plant breeders and hybridizers, you have nurserymen and nurserywomen, you have the people that the plants are named after. These seed catalogs have been used to find things such as the date that soy was introduced into Canada, which was by a University of Guelph researcher. There's also just fascinating little bits of human insight. Some of the seed catalogs will have recipes. They'll have information on kind of the pay scale that gardeners were expected to have. And it really, some of the illustrations are very, very insightful as to how women were being portrayed in this business of plants. So this one catalog has a beautiful Italian Renaissance, almost, voluptuous woman on the front cover, and then a woman in her kitchen preparing food on the back cover. And this like a dichotomy of how women were being portrayed. This is the one that's going to draw you in. And then we know that women are going to be ordering seeds. So we're going to put the woman in the kitchen in the back because you're doing stuff around a kitchen garden. We also have the journals and papers from some major plant hybridizers. One of the ones we have that I have on display in the back is Isabella Preston. And she was a plant hybridizer who worked for the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa and was just, at one point was called the Queen of Ornamental Horticulture, like internationally was the Queen of Ornamental Horticulture. So there's lots of insight there. There's also really apparent gaps. And I think most of those apparent gaps have to do about racialized people, folks who are maybe were not as literate or able to write down things. Maybe they were busy raising kids and cooking, and so they didn't have time to write down things. Certainly Indigenous voices. And some of that is based on the fact that we, as white settlers, really take in history as a written document. And I think that when we're able to expand it to broader things, to visual resources, to oral histories, that we're going to have a much more well-rounded review of what people, kind of the people's history of botany and horticulture. I think that we're hoping to move to that soon.
I'd like to throw out first to anybody in the audience. Has anybody got any questions for our folks? Just pop a hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. If not, I have a few more banked questions. We'll bring the microphone over, please.
So I actually am teaching a course for the first time next term called Writing About Plants and the Environment. So thank you for providing me with what looks to be an amazing set of readings. So my question kind of built on, I'm sorry, what's your name? The last one? Erin, thank you. Yeah, which is for young people today, say, who are coming at this, and I teach at U of T, which is so diverse, like so many of our post-secondary institutions now. Where's kind of, the point, where for you are some of the most exciting points of entry and research opportunities? I haven't read the book, so I'm sure that'll help me, but I just, because I'm obviously trying to attract students from diverse backgrounds with diverse interests. Pardon the pun, but where's the low-hanging research fruit?
So I think one of the overlooked pieces are actually some of the horticultural societies. Dawn, you draw a lot on that in your chapter. Things like the Canadian Rose Society, or the International that had, quarterly or monthly publications. Sorry, they were societies that had quarterly or monthly publications. And the number of chapters that were written by women or that indicate kind of women's role in the organization is really phenomenal. Even David, you brought up in the Botanical Society of Canada, the annals of that society, like how many participants and authors were women. And those are being missed as we talk about it in a larger thing. I think Suzanne, who isn't here today, she uses the term in the afterwards as the understory. What we're telling is the understory. And I love that idea, both in terms of the wordplay, but also in terms of there are these towering trees that is the traditional dominant narrative of white men, of settler men. But there is this understory that is vast and important and really provides that foundational groundwork that is women's and racialized people and Indigenous people. These are the things that really bring so much life into the forest, right? So yeah, anybody else want to?
Yeah, Dawn, please go ahead to continue. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, what's the name of your course?
Oh, sorry. It's called Writing About Plants and the Environment, and it's actually in a rhetoric and writing program.
Oh, great.
So again, it's really multidisciplinary, but we attract a lot of science students, but equally important, we attract a lot of humanities students who would never take any science courses. So
okay, so the resource I'm going to give you, do you have a pencil? You can write this down, is Biodiversity Heritage Library. Is an open access digital library in which librarians, everyone's nodding, all of these old books have been digitized and they are available for download as a PDF. You want to read Charles Darwin's great book about earthworms for Darwin Day and find a nice passage about worms, download it from BHL. And so what I get in all of my online courses since the pandemic, whether it's a virtual field course or virtual plant ecology, we use that resource all the time. They can find fantastic images of birds. Everything is open access. Have them hunt for things in that, and you will find all kinds of people that have been forgotten about.
Excellent.
Let me just put a pitch in here for the Center for Canadian Historical Horticultural Studies. For a while, we published a journal called Canadian Horticultural History, and that is all digitized and on BHL. Yeah, it's fantastic. BHL is a fantastic resource. Yeah, it's Canadian Horticultural History.
And half of the words that appeared in that journal during its 10-year run were in fact written by Dr. Pringle. Who's here with us. So thank you again, Jim. There was another question from the audience up here, please. And Go ahead, please.
If you want low hanging fruit, I guess my words are sex and power. And writing on botany has a lot of both. So on the sex side, all the stuff about the gendered history of botany, the sex lives of the plants, is fun. And if you want the power stuff, it's the history of colonialism and colonial exploration and the role that botanizing played in that, I would say. So that would be my place to start if you want to bring them in.
Hi, first of all, I want to congratulate all the authors. You know, you have done a great job for introducing and in the book. Thank you. So I started as botanist way back in India. And so that is my undergraduate. And then I got a PhD in plant pathology, and I was a research scientist for 30 years with the Agriculture and Agriculture Canada. Anyways, my question is, I'm very much interested in herbarium. Is it possible, I should ask herbarium specialist, is it possible for some of us to come and have a look at especially Isabella's collection? You know, that would be amazing, I think.
Absolutely. Just go on RBG's website and navigate to the herbarium. You'll find my information there. Send me an email and we'll set up a time for you and your students to come and visit.
Super, thank you.
Yes, it's not sort of open for casual browsing, but we absolutely welcome people who are interested to come in to learn about what a herbarium is. Many people assume it's packages of oregano or something. It's just, you know. But what it is, what we do, we have a very active herbarium here. Well, the vast majority of our specimens have been scanned already. We don't yet have it available on an online digital platform, but we keep trying. Nadia has been doing an amazing job of helping us develop this resource over the past several years. So I had a throw out question to Nadia as well. So another one. We've talked about women doing botany in the 19th century and sort of doing botany in one sense means going out into the field or even going into a garden and picking up a plant and collecting it and trying to identify it or study it. That's only one set of lenses. But how do you see what was going on in the 19th century for these kinds of women compared to what you do today? You're the field botanist on this panel. How does what they pioneered lead to where you are today? And why was it different or the same one?
Yeah, so I'll try to compare my experience as a field botanist to what I imagine it would have been like for Lady Dalhousie. And I'll think about her contributions to science that I benefit from now. And the most obvious thing that comes to my mind is I get proper recognition for the work that I do now. Thank you, every feminist that did so much work before me. I write my name on my own work. We have 300 of Lady Dalhousie specimens in our herbarium here. She didn't write her name on any of her work. And and this is going to sound really trivial, but it's very important to me that I'm allowed to wear pants. Now, can you imagine Lady Dalhousie going out? She did not have a choice in what she was going to wear. She was going to wear her long flowing dress and probably a corset, walking in the woods, and walking the swamps and walking in the marshes. And I can't imagine having lived that experience that she lived back then. Right, and she died before 1953, which was the year that rubber boots were invented. I like having dry feet when I go walking in the marshes. But also all the work that she did, and she sent a lot of specimens back to the UK, and all these specimens were used to create floras for the North Americas, which evolved over time and are much better now than anything that she would have been able to use. The manuals that she used didn't have what we call a dichotomous piece, and that is a set of questions, paired questions, where you answer one pair of questions and it will send you to a second pair of questions, and you go on until you get to the species
that it's a process of elimination. It's a very well organized process of elimination that brings you to the species that you're looking at, that you are trying to identify. She didn't have that available to her when she was going out and botanizing in Lower Canada and Upper Canada at the time. She just had manuals that had descriptions of the species, and I can't imagine living with that. But thanks to her work, we now have much more available information to help us identify the plants that we are going out there to learn more about. And so we can very easily get to what plant am I looking at and move forward to studying more questions about its ecology and climate change and anything that we can learn so much from the plant. And having it be that easy for us is really has a lot to do with the work that Lady Dalhousie and all the botanists at that time did.
Thanks, Nadia.
That's a question. Is this on? Is it okay?
Yeah.
In the book that I worked on for a long time before this one, it was called Cultivating Women, Cultivating Science, Flora's Daughters and Botany in England. And in the course of doing that research, I found in the Botany department of the Natural History Museum in London, a portfolio of manuscript materials that was put together by a woman who in the very early 19th century in England, working in a pretty remote area of England. She was not part of the metropole, developed some of her own theories about plant physiology. She was interested in the circulation of sap in plants. And so I had this wonderful manuscript material that no one had studied. And I wanted to include her in the book because this was someone who was much more like the experimentalist. This wasn't that amateur end of entry. But I didn't know how to begin. It was quite clear that I didn't know the debates of that time within which her work was sitting. Who was she in opposition to? Whose opinions was she trying to change? And so I looked for some guidance. And so once I was back in my Toronto home base from my London research base, I was put into contact with a botanist, a woman botanist who was interested in plant physiology. And I sort of showed her some of the material and asked her if she could help me locate what it was about. And she wasn't interested. She said it was from back then. Her work in plant physiology was to look ahead and not to look back. Now, perhaps the climate of this has changed, but in many ways, I would like Flora's Fieldworkers to bring botany to historians and historians to botany in some reciprocal ways. In a way, it's a question about how to have botanists become more interested in the history of their own field, and especially to go inside other ways of looking at plants and studying plants from earlier times that are different from our own. With Jim Pringle here and with Jacques Houet, whom we got to hear a bit on Zoom, we're in the presence of very notable, very significant botanists who were also historians. I don't have the sense yet that the field of botany as its own kind of science with its own kind of priorities and practices and institution is quite as open to the historical perspectives that would help me as someone who is a historian. So I would just welcome comments, perhaps from you, some guidance from you, Nadia.
There's also a big thing going on, which is that the word botany itself is used to compartmentalize and separate various kinds of studies. And today, if you talk to anyone in the university, they'll say, oh, we don't do botany here, we do plant science. And botany itself is sometimes characterized in a way that shuts out some of these conversations. Now, we've got Jacques online here with his hand up. Hey, Jacques, is there something we can help? Would you like to pitch in? And we need someone to unmute him.
Okay. I have a comment with following Nadia's comment or intervention. Just to give an example, how the Lady Dalhousie was doing in the field in her husband's diaries. He mentioned sometimes that when she was back to plant collecting in Charlevoix County, close to Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré, she was so bitten by the flies that her face was almost as you understand. So she was very a good field botanist to endure this kind of stuff. So we don't see that very often, but in our case, it was true venture in the woods at that area. That's just a comment to complete that's just that comment.
Thank you very much, Jacques. That's an excellent point. I guess much of this early work was before the invention of mosquito netting and other things. I've got a question coming in from the online forum for Vanessa. Again, please pick up several copies of the book so you can have all of her illustrations open at the same time. They're so beautiful about the quilts. So when did you become interested in the quilting, and what was it that interested you?
Oh, hi there. Is this on? Yes. It's kind of a long answer, so I'll keep it short. But I did this research as part of my doctoral degree. And when I went into my doctorate, I was really interested in the ways that artists were engaging with the climate crisis. So initially I was looking at contemporary art. But the more that I became curious about this particular topic, the more I went back into history to look at where our attitudes towards the natural world had formed or hardened in Canada. And I think I was struck by the fact that many of the artists I was initially looking at were settler artists working with all in questions of nature from a contemporary perspective. And so I became curious about the particularly settler viewpoint on nature and how the settler history has informed, where we are today in terms of Canada and our attitudes towards the natural world. And so I was also curious about, there's a lot of writing happening right now around landscape painting and how landscape paintings have informed views of land and nature and property and ownership and politics and power and these kinds of things in Canada. And that's a very male perspective. A lot of Canada's landscape painters are men in the 19th century in particular. So I became interested in looking for ways to find out how women were participating in this conversation. And so I started looking at craft broadly, and I didn't know I was going to focus on flowers or florals or botany, but I was struck by the fact that many of women's home crafts had a very floral decorative element. And flower decoration historically, and even today, is considered very benign. It's pretty, it's not threatening. But the more I looked into the florals and their origin stories, or where the designs were coming from, what the designs might have meant culturally at the time, the more I felt that florals weren't actually benign or simply decorative. They actually had a lot of cultural meaning that could be extracted from them. So my thesis is actually called Invasive Species, because I likened the floral decorative tradition brought by settler women to Canada in the 18th and 19th centuries to an invasive floral species that kind of naturalizes itself in the environment and presents itself as natural to that particular ecology. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. That's really great. I'm noting that this is the first time that we've been back together again in 5 years. We have lost by attrition a couple of folks. That's okay. We can't fault them for that. I'm wondering if anybody on the panel has questions for anybody else on the panel after all this time. Is there anything you guys would like to ask each other? And we've got also something online coming up as well. I can't hear what she means by her hand going up and down, so I need interpretation on that.
Right, this question comes for Sarah in Australia. So what challenges have you faced as a woman in botany and a scientist in a male-dominated field? And how have you overcome these challenges?
Thank you for the question. I can't answer it from a personal point of view because I am a historian. But of course, one of the things that's drawn me to this topic is my understanding of the gendered nature of history. And the fact that, as Dawn Baisley mentioned earlier, it is the achievements of usually white middle-class men who are written about, and often in a way that is completely unreflective, as we would say now. These men are completely unaware of their privilege, as indeed we as white women are often unaware of our privilege due to our status of having white skin. The thing that I found really interesting in participating in the seminar was how similar the challenges were for women in science in Australia and Canada. And much easier for me to point to similarities than differences. In reflecting on the differences, I would say that in Australia, we had the presence of a towering male figure, Baron Ferdinand von Muller, who really energised the scene for natural science in the 19th century, and in a way pushed forward the work done in Australia by scientists on Australia's very distinctive vegetation and animals and fungi. And so that it happened here a bit earlier and a bit faster than in Canada. And I would put that down to his work as an outstanding individual. And he was someone who accepted all comers to botany, men, women, children, First Nations people. He thought of botany as a very accessible science, and a science that was morally uplifting and involved patriotism and identity. And so for me, has been able to form a really interesting focus to talk about bring together a lot of individual women's lives around being in this man's network. But of course, at the same time, being aware of the fact that those women were not entirely bound by that network, and that individually they developed their own relationships to plants and botany. So I don't think I can talk to you particularly as a woman scientist, except to say that the challenges here and in Canada have been very similar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. I'm realizing that we're at 4:30. We don't have any coffee materializing yet. Is it going to come? All right. Hopefully it does. As we kind of wrap up the panel, I realize also we haven't had a chance for anybody else really to say anything. I'm wondering maybe starting whoever wants to chime in first, anybody else who wants to. And this is coming in from the outside. What challenges do you see in the future in working in this field or this interdisciplinary field? And how do you overcome these challenges of trying to make these connections and bring these new stories to light? Please, Karen.
I was actually thinking about that and how what we're doing is we're working in the gaps, in the spaces between the evidence. Because the evidence is often minimal or absolutely missing, we have to make this story. You're talking about making a story. But we find by the kind of absence and gap that there is more likely interpretation this way or that way. And so you would basically have to trust yourself to keep allowing that story to emerge as you construct it. And, you know, I've had editors that didn't like that. But it's something I think is really important as a woman academic, is to insist that my voice is allowed to be present. And it's not easy in science to use I and to be personal and to say, this is what worries me as a writer or researcher, because it's considered that you're deconstructing your own argument by doing that. But I think we're constructing our argument by actually putting ourselves into the picture and allowing ourselves to construct the outcome. And there was just one little example. I was looking it up here. I was thinking about how can I talk about
Isabella Glass McIntosh as a botanist when there's nothing left. Like nobody has seen anything, but there's vague references. There's like with James Fletcher's, which is fantastic. You know, like how could there not have been materials? They're likely, possibly in the McGill herbarium, which has been stored for several years during the entire time of my project. But I did make a note. It says, Frida Beauregard, Dr. Frida Beauregard, who is the McGill herbarium curator, confirms there are a number, i.e. doesn't know how many, unknown collectors in their herbarium. So I will still want to get in there someday. It will open, those boxes will open, and we will maybe see.
You know, Kate Crooks is in there as well.
Yeah, and
And-
we'll find them
Yeah.
because there's traces. We know that Isabella McIntosh was in Melbourne, was tromping across these fields, was the first to record that particular moonwort. And if we find one even dated from the date, it's hers. So
And it's so important also.
that might
to-
be an answer to that question. I'm not sure. I
think-
probably
no,
rambled.
but I think it's a good one. One of the things I notice is how difficult it is to know who we're talking about. Because very often, if there is a printed reference, it'll be to a Mrs. So-and-so or a Miss So-and-so. In the case of Kate Crooks, the one specimen we know of at McGill is ascribed to a Mrs. Smart. And you have to know that she became Kate McGill Crooks Smart when she married. And the first names are gone from many of these. And so some of my work was trying to actually re-individualize who were these people as individuals and give them their context back. Dawn, please.
So I'm actually quite hopeful about filling in the gaps because with all the digitization of all the materials, we're getting more eyes onto things than we've ever had before. And when you look, for example, and so for me, I'm interested in Indigenous contributions and voices and racialized women. So when you look, there's a photograph we put into the book about a nice day out, where it's everyone at the Horticultural Society, and there is a Black woman in that photograph. So I'm like, well, who is that person? There must be a membership list somewhere. For me, working with historians, it was like my favorite detective novels. We started to hunt everything down and connecting everything. So scientists, I think the way you're going to get more scientists to engage is we love detail work. We love detail work. This is an opportunity for discovery and experiments and detail work. And I think that we're going to be able to, now that we know about oral histories and we respect that more, there's just going to be more and more information. And it's only a tiny amount of information is on the internet. We teach this to our students. There is so much knowledge that is hidden where I think a lot of these answers are. And I'm here for it, not for my biology field work, but I really enjoyed doing this so much. And I have to say, I learned how to, from the historians of the book, friend Janet Friskney, I really learned how to, and Erin, I worked with Erin a lot. Erin should be a co-author on my chapter. I'm just going to say that. She just, it's not the thing we do. We would do it in science. We'd make you a co-author. But we really learned to read all of the metadata, and you can get so much from that. And we know that there are people who will have known Isabella, and I just think we're just starting to, I believe the information is there somewhere for someone to discover.
I would say I have two big tips. One is ask librarians, ask archivists who would love to be given a reason to search and to search in areas that they hadn't necessarily seen. So they're inviting our attention. I know you all are, and I think that that's the case. And in historical research, you can research in relations to the presence of people. You can also research in relations to the absence of people, and then think about the reasons that they're not there. Is it because of how an institution shaped its bylaws, who can be members and who not? That will be one way, or a school, you know, the curriculum of a school. Are women there in some way on the curriculum or not? How is history taught? How is history thought about? All of those things, I would say. And just one other, One of my favorite resources are historical magazines and historical newspapers. They are just a mountain of untapped material as well. Libraries that have publications from things like school magazines or from the magazines and the general periodicals of a time and a place are full of names. They may be a Mrs. So-and-so, but you get a name and it gives you a place to start.
Yeah, in one case, I was looking at that Kingston garden. In several places, there was a woman named Miss Gildersleeves. And she was actually quite important. She was in a huge argument with the wife of the founder. And I don't know exactly who it is, but I've narrowed it down to two sisters. So, but it's different kinds of sources. In that case, it's actually family genealogies. All kinds of sources are available now that weren't available before, but there's this huge point. You can't assume everything is online. A vast majority of records are still in archives in physical form. People are trying to digitize, but there's so much that isn't in digital form. Christina, did you have anything else on this one? You're good. Okay. Anybody else wanted to put in on the question of how do you do your practice? Everybody's been remarkably patient, and we see one of our colleagues from Food Services getting the coffee going. So thank you so much. Any final words from our panelists or from Rusty?
Thank you all. Thank you all so much for being here and joining with us in this event. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Rusty. Thank you, Karen and Christina, Vanessa, Dawn, Aaron, and Nadia. The speakers who aren't here, the speakers who are online. Sarah's up there. I think we might have lost Shock, but he was there as well, way out in internet land. Big thanks to Tristan and Karine, who have been, again, pedaling upstream against the digital currents for us. Really, really important. I'm really bad with names. We've had the help of a couple of volunteers today who have been helping keep everyone in order. So thank you so much for your help. And a big thanks to Allison Prokop, who has been the coordinator of this event from the beginning months ago. She's had to figure out how to put something like this together because we don't do this kind of thing that often. And it seems like every time we do, we have to reinvent it. So thank you, Allie. And thank you so much for all of your time. I hope you'll stick around a bit, have a tea or coffee if you like. We are going to retire the offitorial retirement. We're going to sit over here on these tables or behind them. And if anyone would like a book signing, we're very happy to inscribe them for you. And I can't see how Ian is doing out there in the hallway, but I'm assuming he's still out there doing something. So unless there's any other thoughts or questions, I'd like to suggest that we just move on to having a bit of tea and coffee. And again, thanks everybody.